Thank you, Kyle. I've been told to use the microphone. I think there'll be some videos for people who want to see this later, but I'm certainly pleased to be here. I've been coming to Japan now, certainly more frequently since 2011, almost 8 years ago, and the events that ensued at Fukushima Daiichi. What I want to do today is present kind of in very basic terms some of the things we've learned, like the lessons and views ahead. So really what that means, let's see if we can get this thing to move forward. Oh, it's interesting. Whoever set this up, the computer's changing, but not the screen. So my slides are advancing, but you can't see them. Aha. All right. So we'll get right into this, and I'll just give you the kind of the three bullets I want to talk about and make sure we're all on the same page. So when we get into that discussion, at least we kind of speak the same terms. We kind of know what the data are telling us about the impacts of these events, and in particular on the ocean, but we'll probably get a little bit beyond that. So the first point is that there's going to be a discussion about the sources of radioactivity in the world we live in. It's not just Fukushima Daiichi. I'm sure a lot of you know this. I don't want to speak down to anyone, but I just want to make sure we all are familiar with the sources of radiation, basically where they go in the ocean. That's what I do as a marine radiochemist. I'll talk about myself a little bit in the next slide. And then a little bit about the future. We're 8 years into this. I think we can say a little bit with better certainty now what the future will look like, the ongoing sources, where it ended up in the seafloor, things like that. So if we can cover these things in the 45 minutes, we'll have had, in my opinion, a good success. So getting to where I'm from, Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, WHOI, W-H-O-I, as we like to call it, Cape Cod, south of Boston. It's a beautiful place. It's also a very unique place. There's about 1,000 employees there. We're a very large, independent, non-for-profit research organization. So what that means is there's about 150 scientists like myself in all disciplines from physics, chemistry, geology, biology, and a very strong engineering component. And as long as we seek out independently our own funding, then we can do whatever we want. I've had 30-some years of having the blessing of being able to kind of pursue my interests. And my interests are related to radiation, radioactivity in the ocean, and mostly about using that to tell me about how the ocean works. You know, dating in marine sediments, the transport of water across the ocean. But when bad things happen, Chernobyl, Fukushima in this case, we actually also are concerned about the levels and impacts on humans. So I get into that, but I don't come from the radiation monitoring or health physics side, more from the oceanography side of this. So that's more of my specialty. So here you see our beautiful docks down in Woods Hole. And some of the laboratories up and down there, there's a number of buildings, a number of spaces. I don't know if people have been in that area. Summertime looks like this. Wintertime, this can be iced over. It's quite different. It was quite cold when we left, and so it's a pleasure to be here where spring comes a little bit earlier than where I live. But since, as I told you, 2011, we've had on order 9 research cruises, 8 of them on Japanese research vessels, bringing us in close proximity to the reactors behind me here at Fukushima Daiichi, trying to get as close as we can at least once a year to kind of, well, basically continue the studies that are being made in Japan, but independently make assessments of some of the same isotopes and different radioisotopes that are being measured here. So this is complementary to what's being done, but very much independent, very much funded by not my government, not by nuclear regulatory agencies, but by private foundations like the Moore Foundation has been our largest supporter. In fact, it's been very difficult to find my typical federal agency support, National Science Foundation, Department of Energy, to do this kind of work. That's a side story we don't have to get into. But I've been able to piece together cruises here with my Japanese colleagues since 2011, a couple months after the events. That's as recently as last fall here on the Japanese research vessel. So I said I have 3 themes. One is that we live in this radioactive world. What is radiation? Again, this is Radioactivity 101. because there might be some people here who haven't thought about it. But basically, the breakdown of unstable atoms emits high energy particles, and that's the radioactivity we're talking about. I won't get into any more than that, other than you've probably heard this term, less common in the US, but the becquerel is one of those decay events. As it happens, we measure that, and that's called a becquerel, after Henri Becquerel in France. And the total number of becquerels is often either added up. I'll give some sums of the total amount of radiation released from Fukushima Daiichi. Often it's per cubic meter of seawater or kilogram of fish when we set limits or go out to measure that. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I'm using a larger unit. It's not per liter, that's 1,000 liters, because that's the units we used before this accident. So we'll be looking at cesium, for example, in units of becquerels per cubic meter or becquerels per kilogram of fish. So that's all you need to know, background. So where does radioactivity come from? Well, certainly there's naturally occurring radionuclides. I spent a lot of time studying uranium and thorium in the ocean. They come from the weathering of rocks. When you fly to get here, whoops, this is a little bit of a delay on this thing. There's cosmogenically produced radionuclides. Most people don't think about that, but we always are being bombarded by high energy particles coming from cosmogenic sources. So basically sun, other places in our cosmos release these. And part of our challenge often is kind of measuring the much lower abundant, thankfully, human-produced radionuclides that started in the nuclear era when we first started testing nuclear weapons, was the primary initial source back in the 40s, 50s, and after that. So human activity, cosmogenic, and naturally occurring are three sources that we have to consider. So just because something's radioactive doesn't really tell you very much about it. Again, very basic stuff. I want to remind ourselves in the ocean what the largest sources, in this case, on the human side, cesium-137, one of the radioactive forms of cesium with a 30-year half-life. How much is there from the various sources? And by far, the three largest here, global nuclear weapons testing, peaked in the 50s and early 60s, 950 petabecquerels, a PBQ. You probably can't see that. That's 10 to the 15, so one with 15 zeros. It's a large number. A becquerel actually is a small unit of radioactivity. So if you add up all of the weapons testing, we release something close to 1,000 petabecquerels of cesium-137. Many other isotopes too. We'll get into a few of them. But we'll focus a lot on cesium. That's an isotope of concern from, for example, Chernobyl here, 85, so about 10 times less. And the total amount from Fukushima Daiichi, about 15 to 20 petabecquerels. So for that isotope, which was one of the more abundant ones, about 10 times less from the closest source in size, Chernobyl, 1986, and something 4 or 5 times less from Fukushima Daiichi. The waterline here is just to remind us that most of Chernobyl was on land above the water. Fukushima and global fallout is mostly in the ocean. For comparison, some of the other isotopes we'll talk briefly about tonight, strontium-90, in those same units, much, much less than cesium from Fukushima, 0.001 petabecquerels is one estimate. Tritium, something like 0.3. Both of these were released primarily directly in the ocean. The reason I mention the other sources is when I take a sample of seawater, these are not the most abundant forms of radioactivity. Potassium-40, uranium-238 are much more abundant in seawater. Again, the natural weathering of rocks puts these in the ocean, and the ocean is salty, so the ocean also has potassium-40 in it. So we're often trying to separate the lower levels of, for example, cesium from these more abundant when we're measuring radioactive decay events. So I want to be able to separate what we've added to the ocean from what's there already. And so that's what this slide tries to get across. Not saying that this isn't of concern, but just to give you some scaling that the challenge is often for marine radiochemists is seeing these relatively small amounts of the human-produced radioisotopes in this larger background. And so I use the word background radioactivity, for example, for uranium in the ocean. So now let's get on to Fukushima Daiichi events in 2011. As you all know, many of you experienced the earthquake, the tsunami, the horrific disaster that was, and then the overheating and explosive and high temperature delivery of atmospheric fallout around mid-March, only a few days after the March 11 events. We were seeing a fair amount of release through atmospheric transport. This actually is, of course, not drawn to scale or by direction. Most of the fallout went into the ocean. The wind patterns determined on land and precipitation, primarily land deposition, but most of this fallout would have been on the ocean at that time, over 80% of the atmospheric fallout in mid-March. I'll show some numbers on a subsequent slide of the direct discharge, all of that cooling water that was used, all of the attempts to try and constrain the water from entering the ocean. You'll see in the data that I'll show next that peaked in early April, a few weeks later. So it took a few weeks to see the highest levels in the ocean next to Fukushima Daiichi due to what we call direct discharge of some of those waters coming right from the reactor buildings, right from the cooling water, that at that time very much catastrophic was being released into the ocean until that was, I'm not even going to try and use this word, well, under control has been used in many ways. This is not under control, but certainly we were able to slow that down considerably, and I'll show you the data that shows that directly in the oceans. So let's get to the fate of that material in the ocean. So we'll first look at seawater. This is just our standard sampler, by the way, if you're not familiar with CTD Rosette, where those bottles go down and close and bring water samples back. This is on the Japanese Shinsei Maru from one of our research cruises. So let's look at some numbers, plots. And I'm going to plot things for cesium-137, the same isotope we've been talking about. My units will be becquerels per cubic meter. Each dot here is just one location right next to Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, so as close as they were sampling at the time. This is data primarily from TEPCO and their own analyses. We put this together in a publication in 2012 to look at the levels, and when I said they were increasing, so the discharge was going up until early April 2012. The peak here, 68 million becquerels per cubic meter of cesium-137. You see it goes down quickly, but it doesn't keep going back down to background levels. It's maintained here out at least over 1 year. So each dot is a sample. This was done in many locations. But I want to put that in perspective. When I was first studying, we studied Chernobyl fallout. The highest numbers we ever saw were about 1,000 in those units. The levels in Japan prior to that accident, the reason I used becquerels per cubic meter rather than per liter, were 2 down here, and that's what most of the ocean looked like prior to that event. So certainly this is what we called unprecedented release to the ocean. We have never seen in any of these accidental releases, and even after the weapons testing fallout, things that high in the ocean directly. We'll get more into that. But let's first look a little bit longer in time. So what about 11, 12, here out to 18 and 19? What do those levels look like? So there's still active monitoring going on. Same scale, cesium-137 becquerels per cubic meter. You see that initial drop-off, but then this slower decrease here that has not yet brought it back to this prior level. This is a compilation from Japan Nuclear Regulatory Agency data. And you'll see things going up and down, and some of that is related, well, largely related to different factors, mostly oceanographic, from different waters mixing inshore, offshore. So we get a lot of mixing of things that are, if I have a slide, I have some slides that show offshore waters being lower. This is right at the coastline, so you get variability on this scale. But certainly levels are dropping off. They're more than this 1,000 line until about 2015. So what we could say right from the beginning, right from, a month or two into this, we knew that there was still a source. Otherwise, If you release an isotope and stop the source, it will decrease as the cleaner water moves in and you start mixing that offshore. So this indicated very early on, even that last graph, that we have ongoing sources from that site. So the question is, should we be concerned? And a lot of people are concerned, and I share those concerns. So we're going to look at those data, look at them first relative to the drinking water limit. No one drinks ocean water directly unless you're purifying it, but then you go through some sort of RO process. 10,000 is the Japan drinking water limit levels, and these are the highest numbers you can find right close to the reactor in the ocean, not in the harbor, just outside. We reached below that around 2013. I've done something here, which I started a few years ago. Actually, I think it was at Temple University, just trying to put my perspective. One nice thing about not working for a government agency, I don't have to get approval to really give you any of these numbers or slides, but I call this line at about 1 million the red zone. Anything above that, if you look at the studies of the impact of some of these isotopes, cesium, on the growth rates or mortality, reproductive effects, generically on marine biota, this should be a fuzzy line. But basically, you get above 1 million, you can have a direct effect on marine biota. So in those first weeks to a month, you certainly could have impacts on marine organisms that are swimming around in waters at that level. We probably don't want to be there ourselves, but certainly that is the most serious level of concern, above about 1 million. 1,000, I put a line there. Again, it could be a fuzzy line. But if a fish is living in waters that exceed that, the concentration in the fish would exceed about 100 becquerel per kilogram. I'll show the fish data later, which is what Japan has chosen as their limit on cesium in seafood. So that's the concern when you're in the yellow area. It's internalizing the cesium and therefore having higher health concerns when you're above about 1,000. And you can see we crossed that line, and I'll show the fish data in a little bit around 2015. And so green is where we don't have that concern based upon regulatory levels in seafood. And we've done some dose assessments, and I'll show you some data down here at 10. I could have used 100, but that's what the highest level we've seen off the US. If you swim every day in the ocean and it's 10 becquerels, this is higher than what it was before, right, too. Every day for an entire year, the additional dose is still 1,000 times less than a single dental x-ray. So we're down in here in levels that aren't regulated, and for reasons that, even though we don't choose to have an ocean with any cesium in it, the health effects certainly are not measurable, and they're well below even things as low as a dental x-ray. So let's get to, because no one cares about becquerels in the ocean, they care about things you might be exposed to and might be consuming. So quickly, I'll just get back to, the pathways into the ocean. We had our fallout, we have surface runoff, we have groundwaters. I'll show you an actual number for that later. But the basic point is, if you have a marine ecosystem here, this is supposed to show you the phytoplankton, the small plants, microscopic, the zooplankton, fish that eat them. They're basically taking up the radiocontaminants by either eating something, food processes, or water. They drink like we do. So those are the pathways into those organisms. They'll vary by the different elemental characteristics. Cesium's different than strontium. So we'll get into that next. Basically, this is a slide that talks about how long it takes the contaminants to cycle through an organism and where is it taken up. So cesium-137 behaves a lot like potassium, ends up like other electrolytes in muscles and tissues and organs, pretty non-discriminate. And if you stop the source, if you stop that green arrow going in a couple of months, you lose about half of it going out just through normal excretion processes. So you take a fish, remove the source, and we expect the concentration to decrease on scales of a few weeks, a couple of months. Other isotopes behave differently. Cesium is very similar chemical to potassium. Talk about tritium, it's basically the hydrogen atom in water, so it behaves a lot like water. It goes in and out of fish very quickly, in and out of our system to be the similar kind of relative scales in terms of our uptake into humans. if we were to drink water laced with tritium, cesium, or strontium. Strontium's over here on years because strontium behaves a lot like calcium, which, as you probably would have heard of, is in your bone system. So it's taken up for much longer periods of time in organisms like fish. So if you stop the source, it would take much longer for their levels to be going down. And that's one reason it's of larger health concern, even though I showed you the amount that was released is quite small compared to cesium-137, which is why it's not talked about as much, not measured as much. But they've all behaved quite differently. So you need to know that when you think about the seafood in this yellow zone that we've been in for several years, of where we're concerned about eating and consuming food that contains some of these isotopes. This is a compilation I put together for some data from the Ministry of Fisheries in Japan. Every dot is a fish. In this case, every dot is a fish from Fukushima prefecture, and they're only the bottom-dwelling species that were included in here. And this is April 2011, December 2012, so relatively early on. This is a detection limit, by the way, which is why it's white down there. They can't measure it below that level. But one thing you see are a lot of data. One thing we saw is that if relative to that limit of becquerels per kilogram of cesium in fish, it really wasn't dropping in a few weeks, a couple of months. Another indication that there had to be ongoing sources. It's also more complicated than that little cartoon of 1 week, because there's a time for uptake and a time for release, so it does slow down. But the fact that these are all high, they're also quite variable, so you see numbers where they're well below actually even the detection limits, and numbers that are well above that. So there was concern, and fisheries, as you all I'm sure know, were banned during these time periods. Let's look a bit further out now till 2016. And one thing I have to say, I mean, there's 50,000 plus dots on this figure. This is all of the data, from Japan beyond the 20-kilometer limit collected, that I could find anyway, from 2011 up to 2016. What we tried to show in color here, there is a difference between the fish that live on the bottom, and we'll get into that source, which is basically food. They're eating little worms and crabs and things that are on the bottom. So that's one reason they tend to be higher here. The orange points, then I hope you can see the light blue points, more the pelagic, the fish that swim and don't interact with the sea floor. So we see differences in fish types, groups, within species as well. Still, we're only talking about cesium-130, well, actually, it's combined cesium-137 and 134 becquerels per kilogram. But now you see on longer time scales, they are dropping off here by 2015. All of them, even the bottom fish below that limit. Early on, the blue dots that are kind of hidden here, falling off much quicker. And again, 50-odd thousand fish had been sampled. We kept saying, we need to do at least this much in the ocean. But of course, this is of great concern, but we want to know how quickly they will decrease and why some fish are higher than others. So there's more to be done. But we basically took that kind of data, made it in some very simple, we have a handout with a lot of these slides, but basically seafood caught above the Japan limits. By the spring of 2015, no more fish were being caught outside of 20 kilometers that were above that 100 becquerel per kilogram level. Now, I just read, someone told me 3 days before I flew out that one skate was found in January that was 139 or 140 becquerel per kilogram. So that should be 0.000 something 1. But some fish was found that was higher than the 100 limit earlier this year in January 2019. And we made this graphic with the U.S. coast in mind because people were concerned there. And we've never detected, of course, any fish. And I'll show you some data on the west coast of the U.S. to support that. But no fish have been found above those limits. So if you distill all that data down for the seafood, that's the story. Seafloor. Talked about those bottom fish and why are they higher than the pelagic fish. Well, if you take cores, and this is a compilation we made of several studies, you don't have to really see any detail here, but you can probably see the coloring is yellow and red near Fukushima Daiichi here, turns into these lighter blue colors, yellows offshore. If you add up all of the inventory of cesium-137, so now you're looking as much as you find, if you take a core, stick it in, less than 1% of the total is found in the seafloor near Japan. The rest of it is moved off. I'll show you next some of those ocean currents that carry it largely offshore. It's highly soluble. It's a salt, right? I talked about potassium. But still, that means there's still an inventory here that we'll talk about associated with the seafloor sediments. And associated with that are all the animals and critters that live there, and they eat each other, and that's why their levels are slightly higher than in the water above there. But so today, there's actually more inventory associated with that seafloor than with the water above that on the coast of Japan. It's less than 1%. It's highest close to the source. We all expect that. It's higher in fine-grained sediments. So one of the nuances is if you look at cesium, and you've probably heard some of you that's associated with clays, same thing happens with the fine-grained sediments here. This isn't all just pure sand. A lot of the clays here, particularly in the south, were somewhat higher. And so there's been a finding of association with the finer-grained sediments. And this becomes a long-term repository. I'll show you some data of how that's changed over time later. But we're talking years to decades. This doesn't move offshore as quickly as the cesium that's with the ocean currents. That's why the seafloor can be and still is important to consider. Most of the cesium, if we think of how it's transported, happens in this way. This is just a beautiful movie that NASA put together globally about ocean currents. Here's your Kuroshio, here's Japan, moving waters from the south offshore with Kuroshio and Kuroshio extension across the Pacific. Cesium, like many of these that we've talked about so far, tritium, strontium, and cesium are largely soluble, so more than 99% passes through a filter. It will move with ocean currents. So the same processes that transport water will transport the radionuclides offshore, and I'll show you a movie next specifically designed to mimic that offshore transport with ocean currents. But you also see little swirls and wiggles, and when we came in 2011, in fact, we saw some higher levels of cesium associated with those smaller scale eddies that actually retain the cesium closer to shore for, in this case, weeks to months. It wasn't years. And these transport times, I should just get right down to it. This is a model predicting the transport of cesium here across the Pacific Ocean. So this went already from 2011 to 2012. These are the islands of Hawaii. That's the U.S. West Coast. I hope people here recognize. But in about 1 year, it crossed basically the front end of that plume, half of the Pacific Ocean. One thing you probably can't read, that's becquerels per cubic meter. I've kept the same units. 10 is this kind of color here, the lighter blue. Down here, it's like less than 10. These yellows are about 100. The concentrations will always decrease with distance. There was some confusion in the press about this, but this is dilution. This happens with any soluble element, any soluble contaminant. It's just a consequence of the big blue ocean that's mixing across. This is a model of the surface ocean and what was happening. It's also why residents of the U.S. became kind of concerned when they saw it coming our way, right? You could put this in red and orange colors and get people pretty worried. I look at these models and say, well, where's the data? And that's what we're going to get into. But they're predicting this bluish color here in the 10 or less. That's why I knew that number of swimming in the ocean every day at 10 is a very small dose. We expected very small numbers, but we actually had no measurements around 2013 when we first were getting high level of concern on the West Coast, Canada, and the U.S. for what had already much higher levels been seen here off Japan. So how do you deal with a public concern when there's no federal funding? I couldn't go to an agency and find anyone who would sponsor this. Well, we did kind of the citizen scientist crowdfunding method. So we made a website called Our Radioactive Ocean. We asked people to help fund this type of work, propose locations, get their friends together, and we would ship them a sampling container and run samples to know what the levels were. Did they fit the models of what we might expect? And so on this website, which has reached something like 1 million views, and so as an academic scientist, I'm I'm very excited to see people had an interest in this. They don't read my research papers, but maybe they would come to a website and try and learn about ocean radioactivity. In fact, what I've learned is that most of the interest is in what does it mean when there's a becquerel in my sample. And once they start actually collecting their own samples and putting some money down to analyze them, they want to learn more, and we want to provide that information in a very simple to grasp format. Some of the graphics and things come from that website. I'll just show one slide with the results. This is a accumulation of results. I probably should say 2013. That was our first sample. Of course, the source is 2011. But in those same becquerel per cubic meter units, everything's under 10. The blue dots, we take great pains in using the same method I've been using for years to measure cesium everywhere. In every ocean, we find cesium-137. 2 becquerels per cubic meter or less. So the light blue here indicates that, yes, we detected cesium, but it wasn't any higher than we had seen before the accident. The yellow, orange, and red show elevated levels here. Some along the coast, offshore, we found a warm patch. I don't know if people here are familiar with the blob. There was an anomaly in temperature that was related to the lack of mixing of these waters on their regular time scale. So the ocean currents are coming here. We saw transport to the south and to the north with those ocean currents. But now we could put a number on it. I was very happy that after several years we got up to something like 500 data points, several hundred people making donations and groups going out, sampling. We had classrooms in Santa Barbara take charge. This red box contains a 20-liter, 5-gallon container that we ship to them. It automatically has a temperature sensor, and I measure salinity, so I know something about the ocean properties. I'm a research scientist, I want to know a little bit more about why it's higher in some locations. Families went out, surfer organizations, once we passed on the container, they could do what they want. It's really hard to mess up the sampling, but it does take, to measure at levels of 2 becquerels per cubic meter, a process of several days in my lab, not only 2 days on a $100,000 radiation detector, a high purity germanium well detector, but a lot of effort to get down to these levels. But they had the fun and easy job to collect those and make it happen, and we couldn't have done it without them. So we're very pleased with the success of that activity. So we're getting on to the future. So I talked about the sources. On the Japan coast, we had 15 to 20 petabecquerels of cesium released from the atmosphere, something like 3, maybe as high as 10 in direct discharge. There is an ongoing release that did not go back down to those levels beforehand. In those same units, this was the first couple of months, 3 to 10, that's 0.006, 0.01 petabecquerels per year. So you're going to see that the yearly sources are small relative to that, how bad it was back in 2011. I can't say they're insignificant, and we shouldn't just count these. We should try and get those as low as possible. They're maintaining the levels in the ocean at something like 100 to 1,000, but that's a small number. So the effects are going to be far less from the ongoing releases than what they would have been from that early discharge days and months in 2011. Rivers, similarly, in the back, you probably can't read these, but 0.002 petabecquerels per year, largely with storms, because the cesium is associated with the clays and sands comes in. Something we discovered were that the beaches here, the groundwater under your feet about a meter down, is contaminated with cesium from that initial pulse. It's cesium that came out in 2011 when things were very, very high, 68 million in the ocean, right? Now it's down to, along some of these beaches, 10. But the sand absorbed that cesium and it's re-releasing it at an amount 0.002 petabecquerels per year, similar to the rivers, similar to the reactor. This is kind of important because even if you stopped any one of these 3, you'd still have the other sources, even if there was 0 coming out of the reactor. I don't predict that will necessarily ever happen. You're still going to have runoff from land. You're going to have groundwater coming in, carrying it from those beach sands, and that process will take a long time. So we expect the sources to continue, but they will nowhere be near the amount that was released in 2011. What else is happening? Well, if you take an isotope, now we have 2 isotopes of cesium, and you go to 2019 here, basically, and again, I think many in this audience know this, but there's differences in their decay properties, how quickly until half of the isotope disappears due to radioactive decay. With an isotope with a 2-year half-life, already there's only 6% left, and so that will naturally attenuate in every single sample on the seafloor, in the ocean, anything that's been collected. In fact, that's why it's getting harder to identify what came from Fukushima, because we don't have this tracer with a shorter half-life that's easy to detect. Cesium has gone down by about 13% in this amount of time because it's a 30-year half-life. Strontium-90, very similar half-life, so it's down by about 14%. Tritium, less than half of its decayed 12-year half-life. Iodine-131 I just put up there because that was the isotope of concern for thyroids in children here in terms of their exposure and dose. 8-day half-life. We haven't been tracking that since the first couple of months after the accident. That decays away very rapidly. So just be aware, if you start with whatever mixture these are put in at, they will decay at different rates, and that's becoming more important. Something also to be familiar with is that there are monitoring has been beefed up certainly considerably a couple of years ago. I might have this wrong, but on that order, even things like real-time sensors. The date on this is March 19th as of 15:30. So this was today's data from a point here at the harbor. This is Fukushima, the reactors. This is a point that's still releasing right into the ocean, exchanging through with tides. Green is total beta. That's kind of almost mostly the natural background. This is our cesium-137 in red, the 134 they can't detect. They measure becquerels per liter. It's just under 1. That's 1,000 in my units, becquerels per cubic meter. You can go online right now and follow that data. We actually do, and look at that, trying to learn some of these wiggles, what's been going on. But you can find that data. You can also look at the regular monitoring data from things like the NRA here, TEPCO and others. And then there's groups of us, scientific crews that go back maybe once a year, twice a year, as often as we can to kind of corroborate and not just measure what are the levels, but why are they higher in one place, how long will it take for them to get back down to where they were. Models are still with us, and this is just that same model. I won't spend much time, but that show that the ocean should be getting lower because most of the radioactivity was released 2011. This type of model that had a point source in 2011 is still a very good predictor for across the Pacific Ocean of what the concentrations of cesium and other soluble isotopes will be. And again, they're in these lighter blue colors here across the Pacific, less than 10. Fish we'll go back to, so we're looking in the future on fish. I have 2 slides on that. I just want to point out again, this is the number of fish that are analyzed by the agencies here in Japan. Yellow are when they exceeded the Japanese limits. Blue, you're just tracking the quantity, and this is every quarter. So about 8,000 samples per year, 10,000. This is fish off of Fukushima Daiichi beyond the 20-kilometer zone from MAF in Japan. This green line is the percent that exceed your stringent limits, actually 10 times more stringent than ours in the US, for the amount of cesium that is considered safe to consume in seafood products. And no fish have exceeded that limit since 2015, with the exception of this skate in single fish in January of this year. And so we expect that to continue. But the point of this slide is we can go back decades later and we'll see effects in the ocean, right? It probably never will get back to conditions before that accident. This is Chernobyl here on the right, many hundreds of kilometers from the Baltic Sea. But if I go to the Baltic Sea today, I still see 6.9 becquerels per kilo of cesium attributable to that accident. Fukushima, if you look at the data after 4 years, the average is about 2.3. If you look further out in the North Pacific, fish average about 0.3. So we're talking decades later, we still see the effects of Chernobyl here in the Baltic. Several years, up to now 8 years, we'll see it from Fukushima. And we're going to see that. That's nowhere near the 100 level, but you're going to have ongoing sources. I go back to the Marshall Islands, and we detect 60, 70 years later elevated levels in the marine biota associated with the testing site in the Marshalls. Almost there, we're going to talk about seafloor sediments and how they're doing. This is cesium-137 again over time, March 2011, excuse me, March 2019. Going back to the same location, this is very close again. I'm showing you some of the highest numbers. Green dots are the sample, the composite of the surface 5 centimeters in a core like this when you try and carefully collect what's there without interrupting the depositional layers that you find in marine sediments like this. What's causing that decrease are things like this. The marine organisms on the bottom, they stir this up, a process called bioturbation. So they're mixing cleaner sediment from below with the contaminated sediment above. You have storms and typhoons that can resuspend and move this offshore. So we have a number of processes that will generally cause it to decrease, but be aware, even more so than the water column, it's very patchy, it's very localized, and so you find higher and lower levels here, factors of 5 or 10 on the given day in what is essentially the same site that we've gone back to. So the last couple things, we've looked into the future. What should be concerned about? Well, one of them I think is pretty obvious, and everybody here is probably concerned with what's in those tanks. There's about 1,000 tanks, 1 million tons of water. That's the cooling water that's being put in today and kept after it's been purified to some degree, but the question is, tritium is an isotope that is very difficult to remove during the ALPS and other purification processes. So when you generate that water, you have to store it somewhere and decide what to do with it. The issues boil down really to this, and I'm not a specialist in decommissioning, but Azby maybe can tell us some more, but we're approaching 1 million tons of water. It's very difficult to remove with ALPS or any other system. In a very small amount, sure, you can take a liter, I could probably do that, but not in 1 million tons. And these are kind of carefully chosen. We don't know sometimes everything we should know, but if you dilute it and release it slowly, there are limits that are allowable releases for every nuclear power plant because they release tritium. It's considered a low health risk. So there's some ifs here, but you might be able to not exceed those limits. And you can also point out that there's already tritium in the ocean. Just like I said, there's already cesium in the ocean. And so we're not going to be adding more than was there. Actually, the total amount, I've heard numbers of 1 petabecquerel, 4 petabecquerels. Some designs of nuclear power plants release that every year. Cap de la Hague in France, reprocessing, releases on that order every year. So the total amount in the tanks of the radionuclide, not the volume. Volume doesn't really matter. It's the concentration and the total amount of radioisotope is not that high. The question is that cleanup effective for everything else that's in that cooling water? And you can be 99.9% effective and still leave behind a significant amount of things like ruthenium, strontium, and technetium. And it's only until I heard it first in the press, in the press, that's not officially, but last August. So it hasn't been that long that they've been starting to talk about what else is in the tanks, what will they do about that. They will have to undergo some additional, from what I understand, the statements are they will undergo additional removal of the other isotopes before they're released. And so that is the question to keep asking and having more transparency, in my opinion. I'm sure we'll get discussion on that. And the second thing that's been in the news a lot is that we measure total cesium in every sample, every fish, all the water. Those data are correct. A small amount of that release, in terms of the fraction of the releases, are in microparticles. These are submicron, nanometer particles that are very high intensity, so much more radioactive in a very small area. They're not uncommon. I've heard some things about these that, oh, this is unique to Fukushima. No, we had them after Chernobyl. We had them after weapons tests. Every place you go, these things come out, And in this case, high temperature volatilization of some of the fuel rods and components can create these microparticles. So it's not the first time we've seen them, and it won't impact the total radioactivity, but this is the kicker, and we need to know a lot more, certainly than I know, about the health impacts of inhalation of something that's high intensity and small in your lungs, because that's a different health effect than everything I've shown you up to now about cesium passing through fish in its more soluble form. And the behavior of cesium in the ocean would be different. In the atmosphere, it could be transported further. I think some of the news stories about Tokyo seeing some of these particles. So this is a different, in some ways very different, some ways not that different from other sources, but I'm sure we'll hear more about it, but this is a question we can't answer. So my summary slide, yes, there are many sources of radioactivity. Yes, it gets into seawater, biota, and sediments. That's where it goes. And the future, I think we can say something about, because we have now measurements of those three sources, the lingering radioactivity in the sediments. And I certainly think there's a need to continue monitoring a site like this for certainly decades to come. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ken. I'll sit down here and just make a few comments. First comment is that, yeah, I really appreciate having gotten to know Ken, and he showed slides about the change or lack of change in radiation levels in fish off Fukushima. And beginning in 2011 at Safecast, we had a very lively online discussion. And among the things we discussed is, what are the measurements showing in things like fish? And the data from the Japanese government was fairly confusing to understand, and we were not really specialists, and we had arguments. I remember it must have been 2012 or so, and saying, oh, it looks like it's decreasing if you look at it this way, or if you look at it this way, it looks like it's not decreasing. And then Ken and his colleagues, maybe it was just your paper, they basically decided it made sense, because they're experts, they have expert knowledge, to separate the fish into those ecological niches, like the bottom feeders and the pelagic fish and the migratory fish and the freshwater fish. And then he could see that, yes, the bottom feeders are not decreasing, but the other ones seem to, although the freshwater fish, I think, also are not decreasing. And that was just so eye-opening. So, oh my goodness, the information is there if only we know how to take it apart. And he came to Tokyo in, I think, fall of 2012 to participate in a conference at University of Tokyo, and I went to meet him, and that started our conversation. And it's been really valuable for me to be able to talk to someone like Ken, who is really so knowledgeable about this stuff and is able to explain it in such a clear way. So, and I'm happy to be able to join him in this presentation. He alluded to some of the future concerns, ongoing concerns, and including this issue of the water in the tanks. And this is something that he and I had talked about, over the course of many years. And last year, I decided to learn as much as I could about the issue, and I wrote an article in Japan Times and wrote a fairly long and detailed blog with as much scientific information as I could find, and consulted Ken, and he had some very good comments on that as well. And basically, just sort of the background is that there's been various types of water released from the plant intentionally. And we're not talking about this gradual seepage that he referred to, somehow underground water leaking out, but there's a series of pumps that pump up water before it gets to the plant. And the TEPCO, and with the help of government, conferred with the local fishermen's cooperatives, who agreed that if there was third-party monitoring that demonstrated that it was below the limits, that they would allow that, they would agree to have that released, because they're very concerned about what will get in the fish. And so that's been going on since 2014, and the testing has been done by TEPCO and also other laboratories doing it. And whether or not they're fully third party is another question, but that worked very well. Then there's water from tanks, from wells closer to the reactor buildings, which is called the subdrains. And this same process, the fishermen cooperatives, they agreed that if it was tested by others, it demonstrated that it was below the limits, they would accept it. Well, for this tritium, it was a bit of an impasse for the water in these tanks. And again, when I was researching this and talking to Ken, I don't remember the exact quote, but he said, yeah, we should be able to have measurements that show exactly what's in the tanks if anything besides tritium is still in these tanks. because TEPCO's information was only that there was tritium. And I got to know people there and was introduced to their specialists, and I even talked to government officials as well, and basically the entire conversation only referred to tritium, tritiated water. And again, as again Ken alluded to this as well, the scientific consensus is that tritium is not risky compared to other things. Now, of course, it all depends on the concentrations and how much. And yes, it's been released by other nuclear facilities for decades, and it's very difficult to point to any negative health effects from that. That's all fine and good. When I was talking to the government officials, I said, okay, can you show me estimates of what the concentrations of tritium would be if you release it to the ocean, let's say 1 kilometer from the release point, let's say what would be at the beaches? And they said, no, we don't have that information handy. Okay, can you show me estimates for what would be in the fish, et cetera, et cetera? No, we don't have that. And this one guy is just going on the internet and he's looking for data or something, and they couldn't answer any questions. Okay, what would be the likely amount that people would get if they ate those fish? They couldn't answer that. And my point was that, it may very well be true that the tritium would not pose a very great risk. And tritium, again, it's not such a simple thing. There are various forms that it appears in the environment. One is called organically bound tritium, which stays in the body longer, which could have a higher risk, and that's something that I think is acknowledged by many specialists, including national agencies, people that I've talked to. But they didn't have the information ready. I said, how are you going to convince people that this is okay if you can't demonstrate that you've done the homework to show that it's going to be okay? And it was a bit maddening. And again, I talked to some people at TEPCO. I was introduced by a PR person. I had some questions, and I said, so can you show me the measurements of what's exactly in the tanks? And he sent a very terse email. Here's some estimates. And then the PR guy came back to me and he said, well, I'm very sorry that guy was so rude to you. I'll introduce you to some other people, and you can talk to them. And they came to the Safecast office. We talked for 2 hours. It was a very nice, productive conversation. And can you show me what's in the tanks? I said, okay. Here's some other estimates, and it was all about tritium. I wrote up the paper, I wrote up the article, wrote up the thing, and at the time I was saying, they're not really ready. The public is not ready for this. They haven't gained consensus. The fishermen's cooperatives, regardless, even though they said it's probably health-wise, it's probably no risk, but the reputational damage will be so bad, we oppose it under any situation. They didn't have anybody on board with this release. But they were going to move ahead with it, and they said, we will do some public information meetings. And at the time I was writing was like May or so in June, and they decided in July they would do these meetings in early September. And like Ken said, in like August 19th, they released information that, oh, by the way, there's strontium and ruthenium and cobalt and americium and all these other radionuclides as well, including, many of these are actually above limit. And my head blew up. I was like, this is so maddening. I mean, I asked them specifically several times, what else is in the tanks? And not only because I want to know, because the public wants to know, and they deserve to know. And they dissembled and tried to convince me and everyone else that there was only tritium. And of course, that was not true. So for me, these trust issues, these transparency issues, all of these are at least as great as the actual health issues. And we just are not often getting the information that we really need to know. And again, a lot of the data that we depend on for the measurements of fish, like say close to the plant, or the measurements of water, as Ken was showing, is basically sensor systems run by TEPCO. And I think they're pretty reliable, to tell you the truth, but you can't be sure because there's not enough third-party independent monitoring of this stuff. So I would recommend to them, and I did recommend to them, is you should allow third parties to measure what's in the tanks. They should allow Ken's people to go measure what's in the tanks, but they don't seem prepared to do that. So I actually brought this up at an IAEA meeting I was attending in last fall in Vienna. It was a session with communication. It was about communication, and lots of risk communicators from around the world, and many of them were very confident that they would be able to communicate well with the public if there was ever an emergency. And I noticed that many of the Japanese participants either government or from medical institutions, et cetera, they were rather more humbled. They were basically saying, this is what we thought would happen if we do this, and this is what actually happened, and there were all sorts of negative consequences. But I told this story about my interaction with TEPCO trying to get this information based on having spent a lot of time and expended a lot of what I considered personal capital and also institutional capital from Safecast to develop these relationships. And I said they blew the trust, instantly. It took years to develop any kind of trust, and it just, I felt utterly betrayed, of course, as a kind of a journalist in a way, also as a researcher, also as someone who's a community member and who cares. So that's pretty much all I wanted to point out was, these issues of, what's in the tanks, what's in the ocean. Of course, the scientific side is crucial. We have to make these informed decisions, and I'm very glad there's people like Ken, other colleagues of his. I point out Jay Cullen at University of Victoria in British Columbia, who also is kind of a colleague of Woods Hole in the citizen, crowdsourced ocean monitoring, putting out very good information. There is good information out there, and we need it. But we also need more transparency from, responsible bodies like TEPCO and the government concerning what is actually happening and what we can do about it. So that's my comment. And I just want to point out this ocean issue is going to continue for a long time. And, we will have to be dealing with it. And stakeholders include not just Japanese people, not just fishermen, but also people, anyone who's concerned about the ocean, Pacific Rim countries, even far afield. So that's my comment. And maybe now we go to Q&A.
Yeah, I just have a political question. The reason they're not, do you think the reason TEPCO and the government are not allowing third-party observations and then releasing the information because the atomic power companies here in Japan want to continue to rebuild and produce nuclear power for as long as they can until they can kind of pull their feet back out of the water and regain their, just reduce their losses. In the meantime, other more sane sources of energy come to play, but years later.
It's kind of an intricate kabuki dance, from my point of view, where there are people in the industry, in TEPCO, in government agencies who care about transparency, who get it. And I want to say Safecast had been pretty lucky in a way, or we had good results with TEPCO. Initially, they allowed us onto the Fukushima Daiichi site, about 10 of us, to bring our own BGAIGI radiation detectors and to map the radiation at Fukushima Daiichi. That was the first time that third parties had been allowed to do that. And they, like I mentioned, there are third parties measuring some of the water that's being released to the ocean, and this has worked pretty smoothly. So that's there. But I think, ultimately the corporate culture, and I also feel that the head office in Tokyo of TEPCO is a little different from the people working in Fukushima. People in Fukushima, I think, are more inclined to be transparent, or more inclined to work with and help the communities. They just want to avoid bad press. And you see a lot of examples where they're taking responsibility. They're saying, it was our fault, mea culpa. You see these efforts to move in that direction, but often stymied. And I just don't know how. I don't know if the PR person I was talking to, who I liked personally and who had been very helpful for a lot of things, I don't know if he was somehow blindsided by that as well, or if he knew all along, or where in that company was that information being held, and why wasn't it released, and why was it not in any of the government reports. So of course the long term is, yes, they want to go back to selling electricity, they would like to go back to selling nuclear power, of course they would like to. This Olympic thing, I think, also plays a huge role. I mean, it plays a huge role. They are really trying to present a reality that the problem is long solved and there's no concerns at all. And again, you look at Ken's data, you look at other data, it is so much vastly better than it was. And actually, if you look at actual health risks from the fish, it's really, really, really almost none. But the problem hasn't evaporated. It's still there. It'll be with us for a long time. So it's a very complicated thing. But I think you sort of got, put your finger on a big, important aspect of it.
My question is, in terms of the long term, for us, we live from the ocean, we eat ocean plants, we use salt that comes from the sea, we eat fish, we breathe the air that has had all kinds of unnatural and very unnice things put into it. What is this going to do to our DNA, or even further down the line, to our kids' DNA? What's the future there? What do you think?
I can't answer as a health physicist in terms of direct studies on those impacts, but we certainly have had many experiences now, ever since the atomic era, with releases of radioactivity. And we've had many populations exposed, and unfortunately one is here in Japan right after the bombs. So they followed those groups. We can compare relative risks, and that's more what I'm comfortable speaking to, is the relative amounts. And in that context, some of these issues were not that high. That's why I tried to kind of condense into the red, yellow, green. There were times and places you didn't want to be in the ocean. There are times and places we didn't want to be eating that seafood. We're getting beyond that now, but we're never going to get back to where we were. So there will be an additional amount of radiation seen in seafood here that wasn't seen before this, but not higher than the Baltic countries have experienced now for 30 years without any significant difference that I've read in terms of that exposure pathway for incidence of health effects, that type of thing. So, that's why I kind of get back to, as we live in this radioactive world, we have other sources that have the same type of energies of particles, alpha, beta, gamma emitters, and so that's the data we have to work with. We certainly don't put populations intentionally at risk, but it's been happening. And so I've kind of been telling people, maybe getting back to the last question, you can be for or against nuclear power, just don't scare people from swimming in the Pacific Ocean. I'm going to say the West Coast right now. I mean, there might be lots of reasons why you prefer other sources of power and things. But we've already released these isotopes, and in some cases a much greater abundance from other activities. So I kind of try and think of what we can control and what we can't control, and look at their relative levels. I know that's not an exact answer to your question, but it's the way I think of it.
And I would also add, we have decades of information about, effects, health effects, genetic effects from, nuclear sources like the nuclear testing, et cetera. And there's not a lot there to say, they're having these are having some large negative effect on populations as a whole. But again, there's a lot we don't know, and it hasn't been that long. And I think it's valid to say, yes, we don't know what it'll be 100 years, 200 years, 300 years from now. In terms of the ocean, I think many of us, and maybe Ken as well, much more concerned about other problems with the ocean, the warming of the ocean, other changes that could lead to great die-offs of fish and other problems related to that. So it's not the same as DNA damage, but these are big, big issues, and I think we're lucky. If you can say Fukushima, we lucked out in terms of the amount of damage we got. It could have been worse, right? And we're lucky that it's not worse than it was, and still less than, I think, the risks from other problems, climate change and other acidification and things happening in the ocean.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. Maybe connecting to this that we might have lucked out this time. One of the elements you haven't mentioned is plutonium. So the Fukushima Daiichi reactor used MOX material, as far as I know. So a mix of uranium and plutonium. Did you measure any plutonium sources, and where do you see the potential of future additional contamination from the cooling pool, which has not yet been evacuated from used up radioactive materials?
It'd be interesting to know more about the cooling pools, but I actually studied plutonium for my PhD thesis from the weapons testing fallout, and we looked very hard in the ocean to see if we could find it. In fact, that's my only regret. I didn't publish that paper. It was a negative finding, but the Japanese beat us to it and showed that they could not detect in the ocean the plutonium coming from the reactors, which is a different isotope ratio, a different fingerprint. You can tell where the plutonium comes from in the ocean, whether it's from the Marshall Islands or from the larger atmospheric tests in the Soviet Union, Nevada, other places of reactors like Chernobyl and Fukushima. And the reason was more in the ocean side that it was swamped by the signal that was already there. So they put some limits on it. On land, they have detected plutonium with the isotopic signature from Fukushima Daiichi. So some of those explosions early on must have released some particulate, some fuel material directly to the atmosphere. Typically, it's more abundant in the study, one of the early ones, leaf litter, areas where it's kind of like right on top of a soil before it gets mixed in, before those fine-grained particles even have a chance to go anywhere. And it, to me, as a scientist, tells you about the sensitivity. They can actually measure this at this very small atoms per sample level. It's usually about 10 to the 8th atoms anyway. I'm geeking out here, but it's a very small number, and it's a very small relative to that fallout that was here before. It tends to be associated with fine-grained sediments, oxbows in rivers and places like that, maybe some of the downspouts that have accumulated over time, some of the fine-grained materials. So it's being sorted, but not at levels that we they shouldn't increase, because that was the initial release in 2011. We have to see more about what's in tanks. You said there's americium in the tanks?
I think so, yeah.
So there might be plutonium and uranium, other isotopes that weren't released. That's certainly the case for strontium-90, by the way, where the initial release number is 0.001 compared to 10 and 20 was small because it doesn't volatilize. And again, plutonium doesn't volatilize. It would have to be an explosive release that would create those particles that came out. It doesn't get to high enough temperature. It doesn't become a volatile gas that gets out. So I think what happens, though, is quite different if it's in cooling water or directly in contact with molten fuel. And that's the chemistry of those liquid and fuel interactions that would release it back. And certainly that's something, again, we haven't seen, thankfully, in the early releases, but we need to know a little more about. And I still would like to know a little more about those locations on land where you can detect it. But generally, it's a yeah, I keep using this word small. It's a detectable amount. But compared to our fallout, everything, to measure that sample, I have to go into a clean room in a bunny suit and keep the dust out, because there's more plutonium in the dust in Falmouth, Massachusetts, and in my drinking water than in my samples that I'm analyzing. I can still measure it, but it's very small. And again, not to trivialize it. Thankfully, the contrast as something like Chernobyl, where it was more explosive in the initial accident. And so pieces of fuel rods were found in Kiev, small pieces, but they were there large enough you could actually detect directly plutonium in an alpha counter in minutes, the signal from that isotope from the core of the reactor. It wasn't like that in this type of release.
Thank you for your presentations. I enjoyed that very much. Unfortunately, I was running here and I missed the first few minutes of your presentation, so if you covered this, I apologize. I wanted to ask you if in the data that you were seeing for various kinds of fish, if you also saw data for shellfish or seaweed that might be, especially I'm thinking of shellfish such as oysters that filter ocean water, and if you see different radiation levels or if they might be comparable to bottom dwellers. And the second part to that question was if you see any difference also between freshwater fish. As you were noting, rivers are still sort of exiting radiation into the ocean. So if you were able to disaggregate the data there. And the second quick question that maybe not so quick, but I wanted to ask Azby Brown, could you say a bit more about that meeting in Vienna about risk communications? If there were some lessons learned from Fukushima that were discussed there, what were some of the new ways in which risk communicators were thinking about how to handle these catastrophic incidents? Thank you.
Yeah, so the cesium is certainly much higher in freshwater fish. They've measured that, and they've known that from earlier accidents. So in zero salinity or low salinity water, it accumulates much greater degree in fish. And so those levels can still be exceeded. I don't actually know if there are fish where they've kept them closed to this day because of cesium in Japan. There might be. And there's certain products too. You hear of things like mushrooms and other things in wild boar that eat them. So there are pathways that are unique. The same way on the ocean side, a lot of I don't want to get this wrong because it's being videotaped. I have to go back and look. They measured the shellfish. They measured seaweed. Seaweeds are very high in iodine, for example, so that 131 iodine and other isotopes of iodine are of concern because they're taken up specifically. And you're exactly right. The filter feeders get that particulate material because they're filtering tons of water, many, many liters of water every day. So something that's particle bound would accumulate in the shellfish to a higher degree. Cesium isn't one of those isotopes, though. Even though you saw the map on the seafloor, 99+% is in solution. So it's there, but not the most abundant form in even those organisms that filter feed. Had there been things like ruthenium, plutonium, cerium, some of the more particularly active isotopes in the ocean from this accident, then the filter feeders would have been higher. So it's element specific and accident specific too in terms of the forms and species, between them. Radioecology, there are very few people like myself who do radiochemistry, even fewer radioecologists in my opinion anyway. I haven't met very many, and we need more people like that who used to, in the heyday of some of these types of testing, were looking at different species and the uptake of radionuclides, and that's very rare to find these days, supported by really any governments. It's too bad.
Yeah. I just want to also point out a lot of information about what's in organisms is available online through, official databases, et cetera. So if you really want to know, maybe we can help you locate that. About this, this communication meeting, there's a lot to say about it, but one thing I want to point out is at Safecast, we're an independent, citizen group. We were invited to the first major meeting at the IEA in 2014. It meant that some people in those organizations got it. They understood the importance to, encourage citizen data gathering and to look at the data that's being produced by groups like Safecast, and that was a good thing, and we've seen more momentum in that way. So the fact that we were invited to present, I thought it was a positive thing, and a lot of that had to do with transparency. And there have been changes afoot in official emergency response guidelines for nuclear emergencies in Europe, in the EC, new policy guidelines that have been presented to the EC Parliament that include input from Safecast, from participating in these conferences for several years in Europe to help establish these guidelines that say, yes, you should pay attention to citizen data, you should encourage citizens to gather data, and the citizens' information should be taken into account. And these are all the positive things, but it's a really steep hill. I think I was naive. I hoped, I expected that by now it would be much more accepted at the higher official levels, but it's still, each time we have to go through again and convince them why our data is valid, why it's important, why we're not, trying to mess them up, et cetera. What I feel, though, is these are professional communicators, and most of the discussion is about tools and techniques, about, how soon should they get information out. They're very concerned about the correctness of the information that they'll present. They know they have to wait a little while to check data before they spew it out, but they know they have to get something out in messaging. They understand trust is important, but I don't think they understand that almost nobody will trust them anymore, especially now in our current media and social media environment. So that's a lot of what I tried to point out to them, is that people are just not going to believe you, and no matter what you say, someone will take that and spin it to mean something different, and it doesn't mean they will have better information. Some people do that just for the hell of it, just to cause problems. So on the one hand, I thought it was good and positive, and they're very professional and very sincere, but at the same time I thought, they're not quite, they're maybe a little bit behind the curve, especially in terms of social media and how it operates. So, and again, the Japanese participants, like I said, they mainly were giving cautionary tales. Like, we thought this would be an adequate response, and we were wrong. And many of them said, and one guy in particular, he's at the hospital, I think, in Minamisoma, and he said, you know, unless you're prepared to be on the front lines in the disaster area with the people you're trying to communicate with, they will never trust you. And that was a hard-learned lesson for people in Japan, that, you know, just sending information from Tokyo wasn't going to do anything. It requires having people there on the ground, eating the same food, breathing the same air, for them to establish trust. So this was a big message, and again, I'm not sure if it sunk through, but little by little, I hope it does.
Hi, I'm Rick Weisberg. Thank you both very much for excellent presentations. I enjoyed them very much. I'd like to make a comment. I'll try to keep it brief. So I think few people have been killed or seriously injured by the enhanced radiation. It's hard to quantify. In contrast, millions of people, maybe everybody, is having their lives shortened by breathing particulates from burning of fossil fuels to make energy all over the world. Recent estimates from the scientific literature say that loss of life on average is, depending on where you live and what the air is like, between 6 months and 2 years of your life is reduced. And of course, for some people, it's even more. So I think I'm not arguing that we should have more nuclear energy necessarily, but I don't see too many people signing up for using less electricity or not driving cars or not flying in airplanes. And we need to get the energy from somewhere. And I think it would be rational to look at the risks of all the alternatives. I'm not arguing for or against any of them, but there seems to be some kind of hysterical fear about the radiation. And I lived through the accident. I live closer than Tokyo to Fukushima. And it's a scary thing. But I'm not so sure we shouldn't be even more scared by some of the other environmental problems that we're creating with the alternatives to nuclear energy.
Do you have a question?
Just a comment, but you're welcome.
What do we think about that? I understand that, and I would say, yeah, the risks from coal production, coal power, are really under-recognized. Issues of, you know, air pollution and carbon, black carbon, and these things, we know they're killing hundreds of thousands of people, if not more, per year all over the world. They're real problems, and I think they need to be dealt with. The risk issue, though, it's an emotionally fraught issue. And again, this is something the expert communicators understand in theory. We get scared. And we get scared about what we don't know. We feel a greater risk from things that we have had no control over. And these are very, very real. And when we look, you know, just zoom way back in history, either for nuclear power or any of our other major power-producing systems, there was never a time when the public was fully consulted and said, what would you think if we build this, you know, thermal power plant, or this oil power plant, or this coal power plant, or this nuclear power plant? It was never on a basis of a consensus and overt acceptance of the risk. So we're at a new stage, and there's something called the Aarhus Convention, which I hope maybe some people here know about. It's, again, a European initiative from the early 2000s that says people have the right to information about anything in the environment that affects them. They have a right to be consulted and to participate in the decision-making about it, and they have the right to justice if those other rights are not, upheld. And it implies that people need to be consulted. And we have to get good at that. And we see all sorts of problems, like the nuclear waste issue. It has to be put somewhere, and nobody wants it. And there's only a few examples of places that generally in Europe, I think one in Finland, one in Belgium, where they successfully developed a consensus inclusive process with local people and got them to agree that, yes, they can dig that big, deep hole and put those spent fuel things there. So we need to do it. We have to live with this stuff. But risk is just fraught. I look at it and I try to behave rationally, and you try to present rational information, and other colleagues try to present irrational information, and it often just doesn't break through the fear. So we need to address people on that level as well, respecting them as human beings, even if they're fearful.
I've got a question on, not here in Japan, but 3 releases that I have heard rumors about and concerns about. One is the Sellafield nuclear power plant in the UK, and how does that equate with Fukushima? That is one release that I've heard about. Another is old Soviet Union nuclear power submarines have been sunk in the ocean, and I've heard about releases there to the point where they may have to bring up those nuclear powered submarines and contain that nuclear power release. And the third is, which you alluded to a little bit, nuclear power waste dumps, and some of the barrels may be leaking, and that is causing a bit of a concern. Have you done any studies in those 3 areas, and do you have any feeling about them? Thank you.
All of those types of releases, there's some data on, and so particularly kind of if I had to rank them on scale of concern, Sellafield has been on the radar ever since it was called Windscale, and they changed the name because of a bad accident, fire, and large release there. Boy, 50s maybe. But when I got into it, Sellafield, and the total amount, for example, of cesium released over the decades is very much on the same scale as Fukushima Daiichi to the Irish Sea. So between England and Ireland is where the discharge pipes are. Now, those were peaked and actually purposely reduced when they started to consider some of the ecological possible effects through the food chain, the human consumers of that around that area. So they basically have slowed down, have not completely stopped those discharges, but they are on the same order in terms of the decades of release for many isotopes, even higher for plutonium, by the way. So very high relative amounts of plutonium to cesium in that particular discharge to the ocean. Iodine, in fact, what my first, well, some of the early papers I was reading were up in the Arctic Ocean when they're using the discharge in Sellafield to look at the circulation of ocean water under the ice cap, trying to figure out how long it take water to get there. So they're studying isotopes of iodine, longer-lived isotopes, 129, cesium-137, strontium in the groups I worked with. So they've actually been thought about for a while, and action was taken to reduce that because it became a health concern. Some of the other ones, the old subs, I was asked about that pretty recently, they tend to be more up on some of the waters around the coast of Norway and shallow water fisheries of concern. They've tried to raise them. The problem is if you try and remove something, you can cause more damage if you leave it in place. And so while they can be localized sources, they tend not to reach the scale of Sellafield, say. Cap de la Hague, you didn't mention in France, is another reprocessing plant that's on the same order as Sellafield. So submarines are hotspots and considered potential disastrous, events if they, if something happened like in removal process, if they broke apart. So largely the isotopes would stay in place, plutonium, cesium, other ones would be released, but that amount isn't high relative to other sources. Doesn't make you feel better if you're eating seafood out of the Barents Sea, though. And so Barents Sea is bad. Waste dumping of canisters and the millions and small amounts that are off San Francisco and areas, those are more dilute and more spread around. They're not considered as dangerous. The lower level waste that was put into the ocean, again, stopped for good reason. The other thing you didn't mention, we were carrying around and still carry around nuclear weapons in airplanes, some of our bombers. So in Greenland and Thule, there was an accident where they had bombs that were released. They had to go back and find them. Spain, Palomares, Spain, I believe, is the location. They retrieved much of that material. Typically, the reports that I read, and again, I'm not a specialist in those particular accidents, about the people who went in to actually retrieve that material, and their exposure was quite high. Not a lot of protection for the people who went, and this was on land some of this, some under the water and some on land. But a lot of this back in the Cold War era too was trying to get there before the other side was able to pick up your weapons. Some of these were unexploded weapons and learn about your technologies. In fact, the U.S. did that to some of the deeply sunken Soviet subs as we retrieved them to learn about their technology. So yes, there are literally hundreds. There are thermonuclear generators used on things like lighthouses where they're using the reaction, the breakdown of plutonium to fuel those. There have been satellites fueled in the same manner that have exploded on launch. Generally, if you put those big circles up there, you're not going to see them unless you're at that source or locally impacted, except for Sellafield and Cap de la Hague, those intentional discharges, non-accidental, of reprocessing waste from those is a very significant source to the ocean and been pretty well studied. It's kind of slowed down the study as the discharge has decreased.
Do you know of any maps of these various sunken reactors and other maps?
In
That would be
the-
interesting to
in
see.
the scientific literature, you find these various
Yeah.
studies and IAEA report.
Yeah, it would be very interesting to know. And just one comment I want to make about La Hague is in these discussions and meetings and regarding this water in the tanks, and again they call this the tritiated water task force, even though there's other stuff in the water. They refer to this. They have presentations from French counterparts who are involved with La Hague, and basically they were saying, well, even more is released from La Hague, so therefore it should be okay, right? That's what the implication is. And then I just want to think, well, we accept things, we can be convinced to accept things, but it doesn't mean we have to keep accepting them. We want to get better, we want to have cleaner oceans, we want to have cleaner planet. This is just how things work. It's if there's a precedent, then that precedent sort of gets set in stone as somehow allowing or justifying similar activities. And this is a situation we're in with La Hague specifically, and again with Sellafield.
So, Ken, thank you very much for your very objective and compelling presentation. My takeaway personally was one of assurance, but I'm curious how based on your interactions with people both here in Japan and possibly elsewhere, you've made this kind of presentation, how their reactions may have been based on this presentation. I ask because radiation is something that's very emotional, and just because you see data, not everybody would feel necessarily safe or assured. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how different people have been reacting to your message. Thank you.
Thanks for the nice comment at the start, and I can tell you some stories, and I won't go into all of them, but I'll give the exact same slides to very different audiences. I'll get invited by Helen Caldecott and some anti-nuclear groups to speak. I'll get invited by not TEPCO executive, but nuclear power companies want to hear this. And as you might imagine, the response is different. I think it's more emotional on the anti-nuclear side, and that's why I gave that quote, don't scare people from swimming. Make other arguments if you want to keep people out, end nuclear power, and point to the cost or the nuclear waste issue. But it does get kind of ugly at times when people threaten you. I've had threats to my health and livelihood and that you have to deal with. Very rarely, though, and I think one thing that often happens is people will say, well, any additional radioactivity is of health concern, and that is true. We don't have a threshold below which we say there's no effect. So every additional amount of cesium in the ocean will add to those health effects. But the differences are so large here that, we can agree on that. I'll say yes. But the amount, say, on the West Coast, when people were worried about swimming in the West Coast of the U.S., those levels of cesium compared to the accident when there's 68 million, that's like the temperature difference on Earth and in the core of the sun. And the effects would certainly be higher with time and with higher levels in Japan. So if they're attributing every dead bird that washed up on the shore and fish was being attributed to this radiation coming across, then this must be a wasteland in Japan, right? Every animal would have been killed, and we certainly did not see that. And so I think we do reach some level of understanding, maybe not agreement, of how much concern we should have, but that those relative levels have been measured. We do get data that agree with basically what the Japanese scientists have measured in seafood in the ocean. Again, maybe I should say this, that, you know, they've done more here in terms of measurements than we can ever do, coming in once a year, once every other year, 50,000 fish and things. But to me, it's reassuring that the levels are similar between the different groups, despite all of that variability. So that builds some confidence in me anyway. But for a public that can't, you know, has this concern, it's just as bad on the government and regulatory side to say, oh, don't worry about it. You know, you shouldn't be concerned. When they are concerned, mothers would call up and say, my son swims in the ocean. How bad is it? And so you just have to be open to sharing those concerns and trying to do something about it, make something interpretable that they can understand, and ultimately they can make the choice. You know, you can buy organic food or non-organic food. You can make choices about where you swim and where you eat, but we all will be exposed to radioactivity sitting here, more when you take a plane, live at high altitude. So those are things we hope to at least give them a lesson, and so they can then decide, and hopefully not attribute every dead animal on the west coast of the U.S. to Fukushima, which was happening with great regularity, and threatening people like me with death and bodily harm because I'm saying it's okay to swim there when they don't think it ever can be safe again. So it is a tough road to follow, but I do a lot of work on climate science, and I think that's gotten even more polarized, at least in my country, where people, no matter what you tell them, or the more you tell them, the more entrenched they get about whether they believe climate is changing and what are the causes. And so I think, at least in this case, from 99% of the audience, at least there's an openness to learn more. And on the science side, we think more should be done and more should be learned. That's my frustration. Why isn't my government doing more? If we have 400 nuclear reactors around the world, many of them on the coast or draining the coastline, why don't we have more people than myself and a few others studying this? And again, many more in Japan, particularly now, but I think we need a much bigger cadre of people when things aren't going bad to be out there understanding the difference between plutonium, uranium, cesium, strontium in seafood, in the ocean, the transport pathways, and that's all really died out. I just happened to be maybe around long enough that I learned from the people who were studying it during the weapons testing years and now could carry that forward to now 2011 and beyond. Thank you.
I just want to add to that, you know, the tremendous value of finding a way to allow everyday people to take positive steps to inform themselves and to feel like they're part of solving a problem. And that's what Ken's project with our radioactive ocean has done. And of course, that's what Safecast is doing, you know, in terms of this, you know, risk perception and things that you can't control. If you give people some measure of control, and a way to learn about it firsthand, where they don't feel they have to just listen to some talking head or some, you know, professor somewhere, that they can actually learn enough to make an informed choice. That makes all the difference in the world. And we were just talking about, you know, the ocean sampling is getting fewer and fewer people participating. This is happening in Japan as well with citizen science projects measuring food or measuring other things. So interest wanes once the initial shock and concern wears off. So I think an issue for us and maybe for them in the future is how do you sort of build on this great experience of teaching so many people and building organizations that can do it to continue the long term. And it may not just be radiation, it may be other aspects of risk to the ocean, acid or something. But I think we need to do that.
I grew up about 75 miles from the Nevada test site, so I learned early on about radiation, and I was 12 years old before they put it underground. So I'm interested in this issue, but I'll try and keep my questions short. One, Ken, for you, when I was in Fukushima, we visited the fishermen's cooperative where they were doing testing of the fish because they couldn't sell them, but they wanted to know what the levels were. But he said to me, if I understood it right, was that the acceptable levels in Japan were so much lower than they are in the rest of the world. If they'd been similar to what they are in the rest of the world, that they would have been able to keep on eating them. But because of the fear and the problems, if they raised those levels, then nobody would trust them again. So I was just wondering if that's correct. And then regarding Safecast, I'd also like to ask, I remember when all my friends were volunteering and they were going to find out the truth in Vigilante and something, and I just wanted to, very simply, are the people that participated less paranoid than they were at that time?
Sure. You're correct that the limit of 100 becquerel per kilogram is the lowest. Other countries have adopted that level that I've ever seen in seafood. In fact, it changed in Japan. It was 500 until the following April when they lowered it to 100 becquerel. I assume the thought was they thought we would tell people we have the safest levels and therefore you can be confident eating Japanese seafood. I think it backfired a bit because there was, as far as I could see, very little information that went with that. So now you're telling people that what they were eating last year that's unsafe this year, you shouldn't be eating anymore, right? And that's a really horrible way to, introduce that concept, right? There was no change in the science. It was all about the politics of lowering that number to make people feel better. In fact, had the opposite effect largely. And you could buy your food in the market based upon the level of cesium. It just doesn't make sense. And in fact, it's not just, it doesn't make sense. And after Chernobyl, they raised the limit, for example, on reindeer meat in Norway, but said only eat it once a year on a special occasion. Because it's not just a single number of becquerels per kilo, it's how often you eat it and how often it's above that level and how high. You did say something that's not quite true. The number in the U.S., other countries, it's 1,000 or 1,200. There were fish in the harbor. There were fish that exceeded even that level early on, but not very many, very far away. It quickly went below that. But it is interesting, the response here was to lower the level. But without enough information, what's the message you're sending? You shouldn't have eaten that. That's the first thing I would think. And that's certainly not what the science told us. It was just a political idea that I think was probably not well thought out.
Yeah, a lot of missteps like that. Even if they're well-intentioned, if we're skeptical or cynical, we can think it's not well-intentioned. But yeah, that was a interesting change. But it may lead to other countries, and I think we're talking about lowering their limits as well. Because after all, who wants cesium in their fish, right? When it comes down to it, and so maybe we should try to be more protective. In terms of Safecast specifically, and any changes in the feeling or the sense, concern among our volunteers, one thing is people respond very differently to having information about their particular situation, and it depends on where they are and what they were faced with, and also the other things that are going on in their life. Overwhelmingly, though, we had a big information vacuum immediately after the accident, and replacing that lack of information with information that you can trust, especially because you measure it yourself. That is a tremendous, help to people coming to grips with the situation. It's a huge de-stressor. Even if you find that your situation is not good, it's more radioactive than you thought, maybe we should evacuate. Or it's more radioactive than you thought, maybe you don't evacuate, but what are we going to do to clean up this place? So it gives people a better grasp of the real challenges and sort of can help replace fear. We've seen that quite a lot. And in our Fukushima volunteers, and this past weekend I was in Koriyama and also in Minamisoma. We did a large workshop teaching 30 high school kids how to build our detectors and how to measure with them and how to put their data on the map. And, a lot of the messaging in Fukushima is you don't have to worry about it anymore, but there are people who need to know, and a lot of young people there realize it's going to be their problem for a very long time. They've inherited the problem, and they may pass it on to their own kids. So they're very many are very motivated to do something about that. At the same time, there's quite a few who have totally tuned it out. I think the big thing is that the mistrust hasn't gone away, hasn't lessened. And the more, let's say, as we get media literate as we learn more how things can be manipulated and misrepresented or omitted, I think people have a lot of justification for being skeptical. We go way overboard. We see this happening constantly, certainly in the last few years. A lot of it goes overboard. But, replacing that dependence on government or other large institutions with your people being able to participate themselves and generate their own information that's scientifically valid. This is a huge change. It's a gigantic ground shift, and Safecast, we're really happy to be part of that, and I'm really happy that Woods Hole was able to be part of that in that way as well. And we think that genie will never go back in the bottle. We'll never be as dependent again on those official sources of information as we have been.
Thank you.
So, kind of quick question, 2 questions. Have there been studies, or have you done studies about the impact of these disasters and the particles that are being released from these nuclear disasters into our oceans and the warming of our oceans? Is there a correlation? And my final question is, do you guys eat seafood?
I love seafood. Ocean. No, so that's an easy. The last one. I worry more about other contaminants in my seafood than the radioactivity.
Yeah.
We have those on Cape Cod. Mercury, yeah, but we have just pathogens and other things going on. Oh, I forgot that first half.
What about the
the particles? The heat. Yeah, it's interesting because there is this what was called the warm blob in the Pacific Ocean, kind of off Alaska, right around the time that the Fukushima cesium came across in that model. So you saw some dark red colors kind of offshore, and there were immediately blogs and people saying it's due to radiation, the warmer temperatures. I know a lot of physical ocean. Well, I know 2 things. One is it's just not out of radioactivity to release that much heat from that amount of cesium that came across. It's not like in the core of a reactor. But the physics of that was just because of the temperature that has been getting warmer in the ocean and the lack of mixing. So the temperature shifts are causing changes to ocean mixing that allow the water to build up at warmer temperatures for several years. This warm blob was an anomaly of several degrees Celsius that we had seen, but it was not at all due to or related, could never be the radioactivity itself.
But that was seen only right after the Fukushima disaster?
Oh, those types of things are seen, even if you've heard of words like El Nino, non-El Nino, those are events that cause changes in ocean temperature on large scales, sort of like this. So there are a lot of times and places where we get shifts in ocean temperature, and that's what physical oceanography, the study of ocean currents and mixing, is all about. In fact, there's one big line on my map that is between Alaska and Tahiti where people who are studying ocean mixing rates, not just along the surface, but in the vertical with depth, because the oceans are taking up, on the pamphlet there. And that's a study of ocean mixing using the introduction of cesium in 2011 as a way to gauge how quickly that happens and where it happens. Someone pointed out, the map, by the way, the brochure that's coming around, there are versions in English or Japanese. So if you didn't get the one you want, Carol and others, we can find them. We're going to put this online. But we're trying to summarize some of our work there. And I've used a few of those images today, or the same ones as in that handout called Our Radioactive Ocean. But yeah, the temperature one comes up a fair bit. It's an interesting thought, but it just doesn't fit the oceans that are affected by temperature, by climate change to a large degree, more than anything else.
About eating seafood, I'd say yes, I do. I eat seafood in Fukushima. I had seafood in Fukushima this weekend. I feel comfortable eating it because I trust the people. I trust the people who are catching it because they're eating it too. And I trust the people who are measuring it because they're measuring it because they want to know if it's safe for their own families. If it was just some government sources, I would not be nearly as inclined to trust it. And this is something we've seen over the past years regarding people's perception of trust and safety. They trust the locals much more than the prefecture. They trust the prefecture a little bit more than they trust the central government. So I trust the locals, and that's why I feel fine eating what people serve me. And I know they know a lot about radioactivity in food. The people are so knowledgeable. They've learned so much. Unfortunately, they had to, but yeah, I trust them.
Hello, thank you for your presentation today. I just wanted to ask about the rivers and the streams and Tokyo Bay, because what I've noticed on my multiple trips to Fukushima, especially this small village called Itatemura, is it just got absolutely hammered and drenched in radioactive fallout. And wherever water accumulates, my Geiger counter would really register high concentrations of radioactive materials. So I'm wondering if all the runoff is affecting the rivers and streams and Tokyo Bay.
Yeah, because certainly Safecast has the data, the same type of thing you're talking about has been observed. And so with the wash off of soils in particular, cesium that's bound by those same clays, replacing potassium, similar chemical species in those clays bind the cesium in the freshwater side of things, unlike the seawater side where there's so much potassium in the ocean comes off the clay. So on the freshwater soil side, if you look at a river, you can get more than 90% of the cesium coming down during heavy rains and storms, both from runoff and resuspension of what's in that riverbed, the fines that move down and then settle somewhere else and move down. So it's largely a kind of a physical transport process during wash and runoff events. And so the number I showed for rivers is quite variable because they're often not making, I shouldn't say, I mean, they're making a lot of measurements, but there are a lot of small rivers here, and it's hard to monitor all of them all of the time, particularly when the weather's really bad. So there's incomplete data, but they certainly know that it's associated coming down at kind of that range of numbers I gave you, and with these peak fluxes dominated by heavy storms and events that wash out. In fact, we've seen some of that in the ocean. We're putting out some data now where after some of the typhoons, we see higher levels of turbidity, the actual particles in the ocean, and then more cesium associated with that. That was actually a bigger signal than any change we've seen with tides or some sort of a local event. So definitely a process that happens. And then on land, you have measurements, right?
Yeah. Yeah, yes, definitely. We can talk about the land situation, but before that, my understanding is that in terms of fresh water, the cesium tends to collect in pools and lakes and behind dams, right, where there's not a lot of water flow.
It's the fine
And it settles down and gets covered up by new sediment, so it's still down there, but it's not bioavailable to organisms, for instance, but it's still there. And there's discussions about behind dams in Fukushima, et cetera, where, yes, they know that it's down there. And as long as there's water in the dam, the water on the top that's released is very clean. They measure it constantly. That's clean. That's even drinkable. But they know that at the lower levels, the cesium will be there. And again, as you were pointing out, in terms of the seabed, we should expect that it'll be there for a very long time, for decades. Yeah, Itate, I spent a lot of time in Itate myself. And, you know, it's, it had kind of a gradient from north to south with much more fallout in the south and less in the north. And this terrible mishandling of the evacuation of that place, evacuated too late, and, you know, a lot of work and a lot of information about what's there. Safecast has a lot of ground measurements in Itate and all of Fukushima. We ourselves don't measure water. I mean, we have some people out in boats who are measuring radioactivity in the air just out of curiosity, but we don't have measurements in the water. But I think you know, there are a lot of research papers about what's happening, you know, in the lakes and behind the dams, et cetera. And I think there was, you had one more question on the end of that? No? Yeah. If you want to see some research papers, I can point you to some. And again, one of my concerns is little by little, the funding is drying up for this kind of research. And Ken mentioned that people studying what's happening to animals, for instance, there wasn't a lot of funding for that even at the beginning. a group of researchers, and some of those people I talked to, they're saying they're having a hard time getting more funding. So I think the issue is how do you maintain ongoing monitoring. One of the good stories in Itate is a citizens group called Saisei no Kai, Fukushima Saisei no Kai, which is a citizens group which has like 40 farmers as members and 2 good scientists who are sort of advisors, and they measure constantly in Itate. They measure their fields, they measure their food, they drive around in minivans with very, very high quality radiation detectors, and they map these things and they put their maps online. So there are a lot of motivated people monitoring the environment, again, because they don't want to depend on information only from the government.
You spoke about the higher levels of radiation found in fish. What are the actual effects of these higher levels on the fish, if any?
I kind of go back to that red, yellow, green slide. Unless the levels are much higher, like that first month, and if you put a fish, say, in an aquarium and expose them to those levels above 1 million becquerels per cubic meter, it's hard to see direct effects on like reproduction and death mortality. But they've done those types of tests and they're relatively high. Long term, there's definitely a whole gray area below that I really can't speak to. Chronic exposure to those middle layers, that yellow zone on the fish themselves. But they are trying to set levels even lower now in terms of radio protection, not just for what's good for us, but what's good for marine biota. So there's a tendency in Europe in particular to reevaluate these levels just for that reason, that just because they're not dying directly doesn't mean they're not health effects. How would you measure those? Much more difficult experiments to do and not a lot of data to go by. But they're gradually decreasing the amount. I don't think it's going to get below where that green level is, in the sense that we're really not seeing any effects at 1 million, well, below 1 million directly on these organisms. But again, I looked into that. I'm not a radioecologist, but there are very few studies with very few marine biota on where to set those numbers and where to set those limits. But it's a good point. We shouldn't just be thinking about what's the effect on us eating them. It's the effect on the marine biota that's also of concern.
I guess I'll ask a question. You've spoken primarily about exposures into the ocean. Azby, with your research in those towns like you've mentioned, what's your view about the re-inhabitation of those evacuated towns like Namie, Futaba, Kawauchi? Do you think it's safe? I know that's kind of a loaded question, but for the people to move back there, the government's trying to get them to go back. They're obviously reluctant to do so.
Probably need another hour. But it's a really case-by-case situation. It depends a lot on the local leadership and how responsive they have been to the needs and requests of citizens in terms of the environment, the monitoring, decontamination, et cetera. I'm critical of the timeline. I mean, on the one hand, I understand if people are away for too long, they'll never come back. And we're already seeing that. It's been like 20% or so typically have moved back into towns that have been reopened after being evacuated. People are voting with their feet. They've set up new lives elsewhere, and there's enough concern that they don't want to go back. That said, I know a lot of people who have been monitoring their situation, informing themselves, and are comfortable about moving back, and who would be comfortable if their grandkids would move back. It may not be Itate, although I know people in Itate who are very enthusiastic about moving back. But it's really a case-by-case situation. The timeline, however, I think it was a politically determined timeline, and with some sense of, the economies, getting population back, trying to get more economic activity, making politically and economically viable communities again. But I think it was rushed. I think there should have been a more cautious approach in many situations that was more inclusive of people. And again, in many local communities, it was a pretty good process where, I've even known some strongly anti-nuclear people who talked about in their town, in Fukushima, yes, they're very involved in deciding what gets decontaminated and what is clean enough. So the local leadership has played the greatest role in making the best of the situation, I think. Again, there's no blanket answer. I would point out, based on measurements alone, pretty much most areas that were green on the government evacuation maps, the radiation levels now are probably very similar to Tokyo, probably very similar to a lot of the world, less than places like Hong Kong, at least in the residential areas, the places where people are actually living. If you go into the mountains, into the forested areas where most of the radionuclides fell, these are not being decontaminated. And just as happens in the ocean, there's a sort of recycling of cesium up through roots of trees into their leaves, which fall down again. And there's a sort of an ecological half-life for that. And it's actually very, very long. So the question is, what can be done for those areas? The government has a plan to establish, they've already begun the work to establish footholds, I think they call them, within the current exclusionary zone, which is marked red on the maps, which you can't enter without a permit. And these would be very small areas, a few hundred houses in different parts of Namie, of Okuma, of Futaba, even in the southern part of Itatemura called Nagadoro that is still evacuated. And the reasoning that they give is that they want to make it possible for people who want to return, as that's part of their responsibility. But again, these would be people returning, and their plan is to bulldoze everything, and then fill the areas with 50 centimeters or a meter of new dirt. And I think that is actually a very effective way to lower the radiation levels. It will be close to normal background when they do that, but these will be islands surrounded by very high radiation. And well, who wants to make that decision? Who will live there? And I just, like a lot of these decisions that have been made, even if some of them are well-meaning or have very positive and sincere motivations, they're often just not well enough thought out, the implications and the possible things that could go wrong. So they're doing it, and like much of the decontamination work and the reconstruction work, and I would include building these massive seawalls along the Tohoku coast, this is business. This is also business. This is providing work, construction companies and other things, and to the degree that it provides, livelihoods for local people, that's probably a good thing. But, I just don't think it should be as rushed as it has been. Even knowing that, I know a lot of places where they should have been allowed to come back even sooner. So it's such a case-by-case issue.
Azby, while you have the mic, you have a special event at Safecast on March 24th.
I'm glad you mentioned it.
Could you tell people about that?
Yeah.
Is that an open event?
It's an open event. Ken is our featured speaker. It's a citizen science meetup. You can find the information on the Safecast blog at safecast.org. Is it up there?
That's actually a different
That's a different one. And safecast.org, and look at our news pane. We have brought together several citizen science projects active in Japan. Ken will talk about our radioactive ocean. Safecast is not going to take a lot of time on ourselves. Instead, we're giving opportunity to people who are measuring food, a group that's been measuring rivers in Japan, not for radiation, but for organic matter for over a decade. The OpenStreetMap people from Japan, and a outfit that makes these small 3D printed microscopes that you attach to your smartphone so you can see what's in your water, et cetera. So it's, a first for us. It's a meetup. It'll be open. Like I said, again, Ken will be the featured speaker, and then other groups will make sort of shorter presentations, and we have a time for hands-on to learn about how people are doing it. One other group is Mina no Data, who has been doing food and soil monitoring for Fukushima and other parts of northeastern Japan.
What's the time and locale for that?
It's from 3 p.m. Till 6 p.m. It's at the Safecast, the building that the Safecast office is in, which is in Dogenzaka, at the very end of Dogenzaka Street in Shibuya. The building is Loftwork, which is the company that provides us with office space. On the ground floor is the Fab Cafe. Many people know that. On the 10th floor is a multipurpose space, and that's where the event will be. And all this information is available online. If you go to safecast.org or you search for Safecast Citizen Science Meetup, you can find it.
And the Safecast report, for which you were principal author, is also available online.
Yes, it's all available online.
Yeah.
And writing the new edition as we speak.
So I want to thank you very much. This is really fascinating from people who've really done research on this. Everyone, this is kind of a reiteration of an event that we did, was it 3 years ago? And they're actually quite different. So if you go on our website, you can see the discussion at that time and today how they've kind of updated that information. I also wanted to raise just your attention. I think this group in particular might be interested in an event that we have on April 11th. Michael Schellenberger is a very strong pro-nuclear advocate. He's the founder of the Breakthrough Institute at UC Berkeley. He's a former environmentalist who's kind of had been very anti-nuclear and has now flipped to very pro-nuclear. If you want to get a sense of what that's about, there's a documentary, you can find traces of it on YouTube, called Pandora's Promise. He's in that documentary. We've done about maybe 15 events since 2011 on these issues. Probably this is one of only 2 or 3 that could be considered pro-nuclear. It's very provocative, and I'd invite you all to come and check it out. So thanks again, guys. Appreciate it.